Job. Um, Job is a very well known book. It is a book that brings us a lot of questions, um, big picture questions. It's kind of a core central book in the Old Testament, one that's quite unique actually in Scripture. So the big question of Job goes like this: Why do bad things happen to good people? This is part of wisdom literature. Recall from a previous video, when we say wisdom literature, we mean, what does it mean to live the good life? And what does it mean to walk in God's ways? So, the question, why do bad things happen to good people? The fancy theological term for that is theodicy. Theodicy. So, it's a story about a righteous sufferer named Job. The story of the righteous sufferer is actually a common story in ancient writings. The you know, a good person loses everything, and or is hurt, or dies young, or something like that. The righteous sufferer, and it's this question that, frankly, we still ask today, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? So Job loses everything that he has. There's this uh, sort of divine discussion between God and Satan, and Satan says, I bet I could make Job turn away from you if he loses everything. He's only faithful because he's rich, and he's got all the this huge farming operation, and these sorts of things. And God says, no, I think he'll be faithful even if he loses everything. And then, well, we see that play out. And so Job, then, that's sort of the beginning of the book. The middle of the book um, is about Job and his friends, mostly his friends, trying to rationalize all of this. Well, Job, you must have done something bad, right? Bad things only happen to bad people. And there's several chapters of this. And then at the end, Job finally confronts God and says, God, what's going on here? And the answer to all of this from God is, I am God and you're not. And we don't really get an answer to it. Job doesn't really get an answer to it. It's sort of left open ended. Is that troubling? Is that comforting? Is that a little bit of both? Yes, to me, the answer is a little bit of both. So Job is probably a composite of two works. So you can imagine that the very beginning and the very end were probably the original book of Job, the prologue and the epilogue. It's sort of an earlier work of prose being just narrative. This happened and then that happened. It's a story. And then probably a later edition, before it became part of the canon, before it became part of the Bible, was the big middle section of poetry. Um, so you might imagine that it's sort of a sandwich. The original uh, prose is the bread, and the stuff in the middle is the poetry. The prose and the poetry parts read a little bit differently from each other, um, and it's tough to date as to when this book was written, because it's it's written in kind of a folktale way, and it doesn't address events that are happening outside of Job. Um, it doesn't talk about historical events, historical figures, like most of the Bible books do, where we can kind of give a rough date. So Job maintains some mysteriousness, not only in its content, not only in its theology. Why do bad things happen to good people? But some of the mysteries, even in uh, something as academic as when. How can we date Job? How do we know when this was written? Um, so three potential big takeaways. There's a lot of takeaways from Job. Um, the transformation of human character under the pressure of suffering. So Job at the beginning, who has everything, versus Job at the end, who has nothing. How does that form Job? The limits of human wisdom and our experience. In other words, we don't just have the answer to everything, right? We can't always figure things out. And then the recharacterizing the created order with our understanding of God and our place. So, in other words, God is God, we are not. That is maybe the biggest takeaway from Job is We need to understand. Uh, Job needs to understand, and therefore we need to understand where we are in that pecking order. Some other tidbits. Job has these friends, and I put friends in quotes because they're not all that helpful. At the beginning, actually, are very helpful. They sit with Job, and it says they don't speak to him for 3 days. They're just present with him in his suffering, and that's a wonderful thing. And then they start to try and answer things. Um, well, Job, there must be some reason all of this bad thing is. What did you do? What did your kids do? What did your wife do? Job's friends talk about God. Job talks to God. His friend, like I said, his friends aren't that helpful. The American dream is not something Job would have talked about, but I think the rationalization, the logic still would apply. How it goes. If I work hard enough, if I play by the rules, everything will work out, right? You can do anything you set your mind to if you just work hard enough, if you just put in enough effort, right? And I think we all know that on some level that's true, right? But not always. Not always. Job shows us sometimes it's just not true. Earlier Job is fearful, not in a good way fearful, but like um, uh, doesn't want to take a step out in faith. He's a faithful guy, but he doesn't want to take a big step out because he's afraid. Later, Job celebrates life. Suffering doesn't always come from sin. Job is considered the best of God's servants, it says. Um, and yet he has the most suffering. What do we make of that? Do the best servants have more suffering? And then some other tidbits here. Job will never know everything that's important between him and God. We will not always understand everything. There's going to be a point. There's a point where things that are meant to be hidden or mysterious are hidden or mysterious. Um, God's ultimate freedom, God has freedom, right? God's ultimate freedom is that God does not need to explain himself. But God shows up nonetheless, thereby keeping Job in the relationship. So Job will see, but not understand. Wisdom is somewhat inaccessible. We don't know everything, but it's always available. We can always pursue it. And truth, these are just some other tidbits to take away from Job. Truth can't always be known without struggle, including intellectual struggle. So Job is trying to get to the truth, and he's struggling on it. He can't rationalize it in his head. Um, and then lastly, and here's one to think on: perhaps true suffering is thinking that the world will always make sense and expecting it to be so. In other words, if I expect that things will always work out for me because I'm a good person or because I do this, that, or the other, I'm going to suffer not only because things won't always go that way, but I'm going to suffer because my expectations, the world didn't meet my expectations. So lots of little tidbits, things to take away from Job, and I hope you find it meaningful and a good read.